I'm going to start. I mean, I usually do these here, but I'm going to let me start. Oh, let me start with showing you some really old work. And I'm saying really old because it's really old. This is work from, well, this particular picture is from 1988. But just to give you some idea of who I am and where I come from, this photograph is made in Limerick, Ireland. And I have to say, I came to photography not as a natural photographer at all. I went to art school in Ireland for undergrad. And I was interested really more at first, I came from that that period where there was a lot of what we'll call meta photography going on, meaning the kind of rephotographing of material that already was in the world and trying to recontextualize it and trying to understand how photographs meant or mean and how photographs serve particular kinds of, ideological thinking or particular kinds of ways of understanding the world. And what I was interested in really, I mean, in the kind of most sort of prescient stuff that was going on in Ireland at that time it was really at the height of the Troubles. After the hunger strikes of the early 80s, Ireland, the situation on the ground in Ireland deteriorated pretty radically. Obviously, the country was in a very different state than it is in now as well. I mean, there was 30% unemployment and there was huge immigration out of the country. But I was interested in landscape and understanding landscape and trying to understand if there was such a thing as a kind of native or indigenous way to look at landscape. And this was the last body of work I made in Ireland before I left. It's called the Third Nature series. And it's really just very simple stuff, me going out into a landscape I was very familiar with and painting with flash. But anyways, I'm going to keep moving. After I finished undergrad, I went to Cal Arts. I really applied to 2 schools in the US at that time. I applied to Columbia because Edward Said was teaching there. And I applied to Cal Arts because Alan Sekula was teaching there. In the end, I didn't have the right qualifications to study comparative literature with Edward Said. That was a little ambitious. But I did get accepted into Cal Arts. And this is the first body of work I made in the United States. And it's really to sort of say that, like, I came from a kind of conceptual landscape background, really. Like, I was interested in how photographs can talk to notions around space, notions around development, notions around understanding the city. And this series is it's called the FOCO series, but it's really about something that I noticed, something very simple that I noticed in coming to Los Angeles, which is that in Ireland, and I'm pretty sure it's in the UK, it's not that different, but if you and your neighbor want to put a dividing line between your properties, generally you'll come together and say, listen, it'd be great to have a wall there. What do you think about a fence or whatever? Whereas interestingly enough, in the US, in Los Angeles at that time, especially, in that moment, actually, which was kind of a peculiar moment, really, in terms of real estate. I mean, Los Angeles as a city itself is a city that's really built by developers. It's the first. They say it's the first city primarily designed for single occupancy vehicles, which is hopefully something that will go away soon. You can see that the history of that a little bit in the film called Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I actually live in Toontown. The Toontown of the film is where I live now, or close to it. But interestingly, so what you would find in Los Angeles, these are examples of, are these spaces in between where it's like, no, I want a red brick wall. Oh, well, I want a cinder block wall, or I want a fence. And so people would build these fences adjoining each other, of course, leaving enough space for the construction of the fence, which could sometimes be a matter of inches. Sometimes it could be, up to a foot or a couple of feet. But in a space where, you know, development and land property values are escalating at an inordinate rate, there's these weird kind of, I don't know if we could call them vanity spaces, but they're like spaces that make no sense really in the larger, you know, in terms of like there's thousands and thousands and thousands of square feet being given to these little spaces. And to me, this was really interesting because it's kind of how I felt. It's like, I didn't really feel like I had something to say about Los Angeles yet. I didn't really feel like I was in a position to, it would have been very complicated to say something about Ireland. Long way of saying, I came to photography really out of an interest in ideas. For me, it was you know, as a sort of note-making regimen, as a way to kind of understand space, or very often as a way to be somewhere, to give me an excuse to be somewhere. Photography has always been a kind of, it's a happy place, right? It's like, I think in this period, I hadn't gotten to the point where I felt, you know, what Jean Rouch calls the trance of photography hadn't kicked in yet. I hadn't gotten enough flying hours yet, but in terms of actually, you know, this for me was like a weekly practice. And when I teach, I try to tell people this, that photography, you know, somebody told me when I was at CalArts, it's like, if you want to get good at photography, find something that you can shoot every day. And for me, this was every Sunday. I would go out and I would get absolutely lost, and then I would try to use, there was this sort of phone book sized map of the city, and I would try to find my way back. And along the way, I would keep my eyes open for these kinds of spaces.
What amazing series! This is great. Can I ask?
Yep.
To me, you know, it looks as if this was photographed by someone who explores a new space, a new environment with a completely fresh pair of eyes. I could imagine maybe a lot of people who were born and who grew up in LA, they might actually never notice those details. Would you say that is true? Would you say this is something that a photographer who was probably not even born in the US discovers? Is that your endeavor?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a number of photographers that came to the school in this period. I mean, I'm thinking maybe most notably was Louis Baltz. I remember Louis Baltz, and Louis Baltz loved these photographs. I mean, he, you know, for somebody raised in Southern California, I mean, somebody most famously for photographing, let's say, Orange County, the development of industrial parks in Orange County, which would be maybe 60 miles or 50 miles away from where these images were made. He was just absolutely, excited about it. And the notion that they're photographed as, you know, as panoramas of these, you know, it's panoramas of these tiny spaces, for him was very exciting. There was a lot of excitement around this work when I made it. I have to say though, I had a weird kind of crisis of faith in this moment. I realized, I guess I realized things about what I was interested in and what I, you know, where I thought of myself going in terms of making images was different. You know, coming from Ireland at that time, you know, like the notion that you could go to a school where people that had been mentioned in Art Forum or Art in America were teaching or were coming to lecture or whatever, you know, like the Jeff Walls and, you know, I remember Susan Meiselas came, and for me, that was just like, whoa. But then at the same time, I had this, I had some kind of a weird crisis of faith, I think, around the notion of how galleries functioned at that time. Galleries were, and to some degree still are, very quite exclusive spaces. The kinds of people that find their way to those kinds of spaces a lot of times aren't necessarily the kinds of people that the work I'm interested in making is aimed at. But it was really, I mean, as far as actually a way to understand the city and to find a small sliver of space from which to speak, this series was obviously, it was very, very helpful. And it did help me get a big chunk of financial support for my second year at the school. But what happened at the end of this first year, while I showed this work, was I came into contact with a writer called Mike Davis. He's most famous for writing a book called City of Quartz, which is, if you're really interested in understanding Los Angeles, it's really considered the kind of the key text. He's an urban theorist. He's Irish American. He had gone to university the first time around through a scholarship from the Teamsters Union. He was a union guy. And Mike's relationship to the city was entirely different than everybody at the school at the time, really. And through a number of kind of reasons, we became close. I mean, he was married to an Irish woman from Belfast who was desperately homesick, and he used to invite me to his house for us to hang out so she wouldn't feel as homesick. I mean, I felt very homesick too. But we became friends, and then his book started to, this is all like 91. His book started to sort of explode, firstly in academic circles and then in general. I mean, he was proposing a new kind of way to understand the city. And what the kind of fact that I've left out here, I guess, is that I was a total advocate of hip hop. I'd been spending a lot of time listening to hip hop. Coming from Ireland, I was definitely I was like 12 years old when punk started in the UK, and I was, it kind of transformed our world, even as 12-year-olds, like the way we spoke to each other, the way we referred to each other, and everything became influenced by this. I have to say, punk rock was one sort of huge cultural sort of moment, and the other thing, which is so strange, how it's turned out. Yeah.
Sorry, Brian. We've got a question here, a very interesting one.
Yep.
Someone asks if those images were cropped or if you actually took them or photographed them with a panoramic camera.
Yes, they were cropped. They're shot with a Nikon FM2 and a corrected 18 millimeter lens. Nikon makes this sort of corrected 18. That's really, I still have it. It's the first lens I bought. I mean, entirely inspired by people like Glenn Friedman and the way that skate photography was working at that time, and the way that music photography was working at that time. I was in, and I was very young. I mean, I never had equipment before I came to the US, like of my own. I was using the school's equipment, and I got a job in a camera store in Los Angeles, and that really, I have to be honest, I mean, the school fed my mind conceptually, but gave me very little really support in terms of like the kind of formal, lenses, films, processing. All that stuff came from working at this camera store called Pan Pacific Camera. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with her work, but she's really one of the most important photographers of her generation. But Kathy Opie used to work. We used to work together there, and I just remember. I'm not sure if any of you guys are familiar with her work. She's an absolute beast. But I just remember feeling like intimidated by how much I didn't know technically, actually, because at undergrad it was a painting school. It wasn't I wasn't able to study photography. So, I did like what they used to call blocks. So I did blocks, but I really didn't know anything. I mean, I was really green in the beginning. And so this was me learning to color print. And this was me, cropping 35 millimeter negs and blowing them up to 20 by 24. So yeah, good question. So basically, out of these conversations with Mike Davis, came this work, and it came out into the world in 1993. Basically, what happened was that Mike's book started to explode, really sell a lot of copies, and there was suddenly this interest in Los Angeles. I mean, there was interest in Los Angeles as a sort of template for what a city, for the kind of mistakes that a city could make, but also for what a city might actually be. And in terms of how do you unpack a city, and how, what are the traces or mappings that you can, understand. And anyway, Mike you know, when Mike was working on his book, I was constantly in his ear saying like, you know, have you heard NWA? Do you know what's going on with this group? Do you know about the organization of, you know, how the Black Arts movement is playing into the formulations around hip hop, all this kind of stuff. But it was really me as a fan. It wasn't me I had any notion that there was like a job to be had here or something like that at all. I was just a fan. And in those days, you know, the way the culture was like, it wasn't necessarily good enough to be just a fan. You had to be somebody who was kind of an advocate and somebody potentially who could contribute something, even if you were coming from somewhere completely like I was, where a lot of people didn't even know where that was. So Mike said to me, you know, why don't you make photographs of this? And of course, to be honest, I hadn't even photographed people at that moment. And so I started. He had a French academic journal wanted him to edit an issue, and he asked me if I would provide photos, and then he asked me if I would make a photo essay about hip hop in LA. It was really like the first time I'd ever been asked to photograph something like that, where there was money involved, where it was serious, where we knew exactly where it was going to get published, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it was the beginning of the summer holidays of 1991. And I just, in earnest, went off and started making images, started talking to people, started sort of gathering kind of oral histories. And I came back after a month and he was just in shock, basically like, wow, you've really kind of got far with this. And I didn't feel like that at all to me. And then he said, let's pitch it as a book. And yeah, they accepted the idea of the book. The initial title of the book was There's a Riot Going On, which is a title of a Sly Stone album from that period, from the end of the 60s. Of course, I was working on the book in April of 1992, and there literally ended up being a very most significant incident of civil unrest in the history of the United States happened in April 29th through May the 4th of 1992. The Rodney King riots, if you're not familiar. It's a very significant case, actually, in many respects. It'd be nice to just spend a second and explain it if you're not familiar. But a man was pulled over, who was driving recklessly, was pulled over by a number of police, and at the top of the valley, actually, not far at all where those photographs were made. And the police basically, according to them, he wasn't following instructions, and then they beat him to within an inch of his life. I mean, he had 30 fractures in his face. And what they didn't know, of course, is that there was an apartment building across the street, and there was a man in that apartment building who had just gotten a VHS camera. And when he saw the police incident, he just went for his camera and started shooting. And he recorded this, you know, just kind of mind-boggling. Well, I mean, I mean, if you've been following the news at all in the past week or two, you'll know exactly what I mean. But a case of police violence against a citizen, an African-American citizen, that just sent the world into shock, basically. And that had happened in 91. I think it was like March 91, I think. And then the case came to, you know, they were prosecuted by the city, the police officers, and acquitted, found not guilty. And that was April 29th, 1992. And within hours, the city was on fire. And then it went for 5 days, and there was, I don't know how many billions of dollars of damage. There was 30 people killed. There was, yeah, it was an insane time to be in LA and to be working on a project like this. But I have to be honest, it really informed, it really kind of confirmed a lot of things that I'd been thinking about and working on the book, and then kind of gave us the confidence to kind of pursue certain things in the book. it's very difficult actually working on this book to actually explain to people just how can I say it? Just how tense it was on the ground, and just how much police violence was going on, police violence and corruption. And to some degree, you know, it's different now, but the sort of structural reforms that are necessary to stop this haven't been put into place. In fact, you know, I was just watching something the last few days, and they said that the net outcome of this riot against police violence in Los Angeles in 1992 was an increase in the police force, an increase in police budgets. So our budget here for the city of Los Angeles at the moment is super contentious, but is 54% goes to the police, you know, and that's a city that's meant to cover all kinds of things from health to education to everything. When you think of more than 50% of that budget is going to the police, it's kind of like something's wrong with this picture. So anyway, this book is an oral history of hip hop in Los Angeles, accompanied by a photo essay, all black and white. And some of the photographs are in this, the more recent book, which is like 20 years later, which I'd like to show you now. And I'll go through the beginning of this, let me see if this works. Okay. So somewhere in the middle of this, people start calling me B+, and it sticks. My last name is Cross, and if you look at that plus sign in the back there, it's a cross too. But I used to write just B with a cross on the bottom of my prints, and my work started to get published, and often they would scan the signature as well. And then I have an old friend who started saying, "Oh, you're that B+ guy," and then it stuck somehow in the way that nicknames do. In any event, this book is Ghostnotes. This came out at the end of 2017. And it's really an opportunity for me to kind of have to be honest. Like I've done a lot of work over the years between 1990, you know, after I graduated, I start to, I'm finishing the book. And then secondly, I got laid off from my job. I went to a photo conference, and I was, you know, got permission to go. And while I was at the conference, which was sponsored by AGFA, I remember really well, my friend wrote to me and said they laid you off. And so when I came back, I said, that's it. I'm not going to have a regular job no more. I'm going to shoot now. That's it. So I started shooting, and I haven't stopped. I mean, that's, you know, that was 92. And then, yeah, I mean, I've lived on this exclusively since 92. Until 2013, when I accepted a job at the University of California, San Diego, as a professor in the Department of Visual Arts. So let me skip through the texts and go to these photos. Oops. Ever since studying with Sakula and thinking about photography and sort of understanding what works for me and what doesn't work for me, I've been interested in the notion of sequencing of images. This is something really that goes back to, I don't know, photographer that I'm interested in the sequences is Walker Evans. But there's a number of photographers over the years. Obviously, Robert Frank is another example of somebody who's really interested in sequencing. And I've always been interested in sequencing. I also kind of have had a kind of love-hate relationship with the notion of the single image. I mean, I think a big part of the kind of conceptual thinking about the kind of work I'm interested in is how do you sort of contain, or at least delimit, if you will, the kinds of readings that work has. And obviously this is an important question for me, because the questions around sort of representation are important, especially given the kind of work I'm doing, the kind of communities I work in. So anyways, that's just by way of saying, so this is sequenced very much like music to me, the way I think of it. You know, it's very free. There's sort of repetitions that happen. There's kinds of rhyming schemes. There's things that line up together. There's things that create echoes. So in any event, it's called Ghost. The name of the book is Ghostnotes, Music of the Unplayed. Ghostnotes, just a quick explanation of the title. Ghostnotes are the unplayed notes or sounds that exist when drummers play. So basically, if you can imagine a drummer playing a drum kit, obviously the main thing we're asked to pay attention to is the hits, whether it be the kick or the hi-hat or the snare or the cymbals, when the drummer actually, with agency and timing hits these things. But then the body isn't exactly in a completely synchronous relationship to the drum kit, in the sense of, very often drummers, in order to keep time, do other things with their hands. When a hand isn't meant to play, they'll put the hand on the snare, or they'll put their hand, sometimes they'll tap their lap with the other hand, and then sometimes even the kit themselves, the snare will resonate depending on how it's tuned. There's all kinds of other sounds that are happening. And they call those ghost notes. And ghost notes really is the difference between, listening to Clyde Stubblefield play with James Brown and listening to the drummer at your local bar playing a James Brown song, which is that the Clyde Stubblefield, all the kind of incidentals make sense. Most famously, there's a video of Bernard Purdie, one of the most recorded drummers of all time, talking about ghost notes and sort of boasting about his ghosts. And for me, I always thought that this was a very rich way to think about photography, as a kind of ghost noting, as these in-between moments that often only existed in the camera, and it happened so fast that you didn't actually see it really. It was almost like an apparition, but you think you got it. And then in terms of sequencing, again, this kind of in-between space, these spaces between photographs that engender certain kinds of meaning as well. So for me, it's just a sort of rich title. So, and the music of the unplayed is really, it refers to that, on one sense, the sense of music that's unintentioned or unplayed, like we didn't sit down to do this, but it happened that way. And then it's also refers to one of my great mentors, a jazz musician called Horace Tapscott, has a record called Music of the Unsung. And so anyways, I'm going to move forward. This is the first image in the book. So on the left page, there's a photograph from Havana I made in 1997. And on the right is an image I made in downtown Los Angeles of a motorcycle club called Time Divided. The photograph on the left is sort of, it's like, this is a music photo book, what the hell? But it's really, it's for the direction provided by those who have bicycles with no wheels and no saddles. I mean, there's just something humorous about this idea for me, is that the woman is giving directions to this guy. And her bike has neither wheels or a saddle. And yeah, it just something to bear in mind in terms of how this is about to work. Okay, this is the prologue of the book. It's a photograph from Colombia, from an area of Colombia called Choco, which is very, very remote jungle region in the northwest of Colombia. This is a drummer called King Erison. King Erison is he's from the Bahamas. He's the drummer on a track, or he's the percussionist on a track by this group called the Incredible Bongo Band. And there's a song called Apache, which is really, they say, is the first break used in hip hop, the first sort of extended drum part of a song that came to sort of be an emblematic, a kind of pointer in the road of where hip hop was about to go, from the early 70s. This is a side move really, but this is the cover of the book, and this is a photograph of a sound system repair in rural Jamaica. I'm not sure to what extent you guys are familiar with music history, but hip hop as it emerged in New York in the early 70s was led by three DJs, Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, and Africa Bambaataa, and they each kind of had different roles. But what Herc brought, and Herc was Jamaican and had just arrived in New York, was Herc brought the tradition of the sound system. And for me, this is sort of central to the thesis of this series of photographs, is about sound systems, which is that it's a new way of understanding music and understanding how music can be made. And Herc is very important, but Herc is really bringing a tradition that begins in Jamaica in the mid-40s. Jamaicans, well, I have some ideas why, but before most other people had a relationship to recorded music and had a relationship to the outside world through recorded music, that's really quite unique. And Jamaicans embody a kind of what we'll call a maroon fugitivity, is what the writer Greg Tate calls it. But it's this sort of a relationship to the world through music, specifically through recorded music and the replaying of recorded music for large audiences. And so the sound system kind of culture of Jamaica really coming out of the late 40s, which is kind of mad to imagine people playing 78s and converting household furniture into speaker units. But that really did happen in the late 40s in Jamaica. The first sound system operator is a guy called Tom the Great Sebastian. Look him up. But I've done a lot of work in Jamaica, and this is a kind of important image. Let me move on. Sound system names from Jamaica. And then this is Kool Herc. And this is really the first hip hop DJ. In the projects in the Bronx in 1972, he had this party, and they say that's the beginning of hip hop. I have to say, okay, like I should probably say here that it's odd for an Irish guy to suddenly, but I don't know what it was really, but amongst me and a number of my friends in that period, in the mid 80s, the most important thing going on culturally was hip hop. And for us, I don't know, it just became, I was absolutely committed to it. I would be still committed to it had I not made these, I had not begun the process of making these images. But obviously through making the images and then realizing how little I knew became really important. This is the house, former house of King Tubby, who's the man who invented dub, which is a really, really important, it's the guy that decided that the equipment that we listen to music through is also an instrument, which is very much part of the kind of technological trajectory that happens really through the 70s with the development of DJ equipment, and very much, a number of folks have said that the contemporary, and I would concur, that the contemporary music world wouldn't exist in the same way without King Tubby. A television repairman who liked to build sound systems, basically. And so he built sound systems for all the different crews in Jamaica. And then he was murdered right there in his driveway in 1989. His street is on the front line between two parts of Kingston that were warring at that time. And but somebody came to rob him basically and murdered him right there in his driveway. But he was an extraordinary man, a big influence, and I was happy to get to go there and make this image. On the left is a drummer from I guess he was most active in the 50s, 60s, 70s. His name is Paul Humphrey, but he had played with everybody from Frank Sinatra to Frank Zappa to John Coltrane even. And he was playing in Los Angeles, and he was being sampled a lot. And I went and found him and asked him if he'd be down to make photographs. And then we ended up making a film with him. And on the right is a young kid in Fresno, California, from the cover of a record by an MC called, oh my goodness, I just spaced on his name. But yeah, I love this photograph. I spent a long time making bubbles and trying to catch it with a Hasselblad, which wasn't very much fun, but I did get this. There's two that I liked out of, like, I don't know, a few hundred images I made. but working with the Hasselblad like this is not really meant for sports photography, so to speak. So everybody okay? We still on board? You can still hear me?
All good, thanks.
All good. All right, I'll keep moving. Oops. And the last photograph of this prologue is an image from Colombia. And the reason it's there is because that W has become a kind of, it's a symbol. It's the cover of my first book. It comes from Watts. Originally, people would throw up a W for Watts, which is up in Los Angeles. And then it was adopted to mean West Coast, which is a sort of a very kind of sectarian part of the hip hop world, is that you represent for your region. But this is in Buenaventura in Colombia, and I'm shooting out through the window of my van. We're headed to the pier to go to a place called Timbiquí, a very kind of remote area. We'd spend 4 hours on a boat to get there. And I don't know what happened. These kids just roll up and throw this sign, and it was just too good. So there it is. All right, so the book is organized into 2 halves, side A and side B. And
I must say, Brian, I really love your music references. I mean, this is so absolutely amazing. I mean, particularly when you talk about things like resonances and ghost notes. Me being an ex-drummer, yeah. So I would really say I mean, music very much is about, well, about structure and also a certain element of loose elements. Yeah. So, if everything is too clearly structured, it's boring. But if everything is too chaotic, it's just like that. So it's about finding just this right spot. I think in your images, this concept comes across just in such a perfect way, right? It is about, because you have to react. You have to react to the structures that you find. You have to make compositions that actually make this image accessible and readable, but you don't want to make it too clean and kind of erase all those ghost notes, all those resonances. This is perfect. Sorry, don't want to interrupt you, but
no, not at all. I'm happy for the interruption, and obviously, clearly, like, questions help. But I mean, I think this is there's an American artist called Arthur Jaffa, and he said that he's interested in making films that ascribe to the condition of music. And obviously for African Americans, the role of music and the way music has found its way into people's lives in this country is really significant. In the way that, let's say, for Irish people, we're most known for our writers. I mean, we it was a big bone of contention when I was at school in Ireland, is that we would be like, we're not trying to make art that ascribes to Joyce, or that ascribes to Samuel Beckett, or that ascribes to Brendan Behan, or that ascribes to, and whereas in the case of Arthur Jaffa's idea is that, somehow music reaches us and on so many different levels. Like you hear music not just with your ears, but with your body. And I mean, it's a kind of a crazy thing to say, but I think there is the possibility. I have come across photographs that I didn't really have a chance to think, what they meant, but I wept. I'm thinking of the photographs of Roy DeCarava. I remember the first time I encountered the photographs of Roy DeCarava. There's a photograph of Ben Webster hugging John Coltrane, and it actually made me weep. And it wasn't like I had to think about it. It just it was able to reach you in that way, And music does that. Obviously not to everybody, but if you're sensitive to it, music has a way of reaching you. It makes you feel things in ways that you don't have a chance to think. It just happens. And I think, for a lot of us musicians and artists, I think this is something that we, I'd like to think that I ascribe to, or that I aspire to, at best. Okay, so let me move on. The book in the end is a 200, I think it's 234 image long suite of images. So we're going to get through, I don't know how we're doing time wise, but we're going to get through a little bit of it. Obviously it's online. I think there's a link, you can check it. And obviously, just let me say, like, I'm super happy to be invited to do this, and I know that this is kind of awkward, but I am available. I do answer emails from people I haven't met, and if there's something that occurs to you after this and you'd like to reach out, I would just like to extend that invitation, that I'm not like that busy that I can't share something or point you in the direction. And I like to think of my practice as a social one. So anyways, that's, I'm putting that out there. Here we go. So it starts in LA. And this is that's a weirdly tragic photograph. It's a tattoo. I just photographed it at the time. I remember being like, oh wow, you got a new tattoo. Damn, look at that. Subsequently, maybe a year or two after this, he was shot in the neck and he's paraplegic now. As an MC from a group called Psycho Rom, that were like a kind of second tier Cypress Hill group that then developed a career of their own. But this cat ended up in this very tragic incident at a burger place, and is now was shot in the neck and is paraplegic. So for me, it's kind of a personal. There's a lot of different layers to why it would be the first image. This is another one, and this. I was saying earlier about this idea of finding something that you can photograph every day that will allow you to kind of grow your eye, if you will. This is one of those projects for me. Back in 96, 97, I started to shoot with a reflex medium format 645 Fuji camera. And the reflex, the aspect that you weren't actually seeing the frame, even though there was a little bit of correction in the viewfinder, you still never really were seeing what you were shooting. You were a little bit above and a little bit to the left. So you're constantly, and so to teach myself the correction, I decided, I don't even remember the day I started this, but I decided I would start to photograph mattresses discarded on the street in Los Angeles. And that's 1997 maybe. By now there's like, I don't know, I think there's 2,000 mattress photos basically that that I like. And I've kind of stopped, unofficially kind of stopped doing it, but it's weird. I still see mattresses on the street and I get giddy and want to go shoot, but I have to stop. But basically the way it works here is that if you have big items that need to be discarded, you put it on the street and then you call the city, and there's a particular garbage truck that will come and pick it up. And what it means is that you end up with these great rectangles left around the city. And for me, it was just too nice of an opportunity. At first, I didn't take it too seriously. I was really, it was an exercise really to understand how the camera worked, so that I was able to correct my lines and understand, like, how the parallax worked. But then after a while, I started to think photos more seriously, especially when I saw there's a number of photographs from the early period of hip hop. The Bronx at that time was pretty bombed out, and kids would play. You'd see kids playing, photographs of kids playing, or there's a very famous Jamel Shabazz photograph that the Roots used on a cover of one of their records, where it's a kid doing a somersault using a mattress, like in the middle of a vacant lot. And then I start to think, like, yeah, I'm liking this. I should say, I mean, another thing to think about here perhaps is that the school I studied at, which is CalArts, is really a school that at that moment had a very strong relationship to the whole new topographics movement. I don't know how familiar you guys are with that, but that's something to consider as well. There's a kind of urban landscape photography that's really about understanding the experience of cities. I'm thinking of people like Lewis Baltz, for example.
Yeah.
There's a good example, but
Brian,
there's a number of others. Yep.
I've got a question from Martin. He asks, do you think you would have taken the same image if you would have stayed in Ireland, or was LA something that shook you into it? What do you think?
Yeah, unquestionably. You know, what you said about the photographs of the spaces between buildings and this notion of somebody with fresh eyes. I mean, everything did look new when I got here. I had very little connection to anything. I understood very little, but everything looked new. And that really, it helped, I have to be honest, because it allowed me to look at things that perhaps Angelenos would think of as mundane and to see them anew. And I remember what's interesting is actually, and it's good that you asked this question, because I remember the first time going back to Ireland and having the eyes to see things that I would have otherwise considered probably mundane or quotidian or ordinary, but to see them in a slightly different way and to actually engage with them then and start to make photographs. So I think you're onto something there, which is that the idea that it does help if there's a certain strangeness to what you're looking at, if you allow yourself to see things in outside of the ordinary. And sometimes, I have to be honest, like sometimes that occurs in the process of making, but sometimes it occurs afterwards in editing. But I think, the rule we used to have back in the day was it's quicker to shoot and make the decision afterwards than it is to be standing out there thinking, is this something I want to photograph right now? Just photograph it. Just respond. Just put yourself in a position to respond and then make sense of it afterwards. Because a lot of times it's not, a photograph looks profoundly different on your computer screen in your house or in your office or your studio than it does on the back of your camera. And I mean, in those days, obviously there was no back of the camera because we were shooting film. But even Polaroids, even in the process, things look different when you get back, and it's better to shoot. I mean, that's what I tell my students, shoot. So, yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I would have, no, I think I would have been of much different practice had I stayed in Ireland, I think. Even though now I look at Ireland and, wow, there's a burgeoning hip hop movement there. It's kind of amazing. So who knows, yeah, maybe I'll go back and shoot that. I don't know. It's a place called now I'm completely lost about it. I think it's called The Den, but it was a place where music was made at the top of the valley that these guys lived in, and they had just moved out, but it was a space that was important. This photograph is from the era of the first book, and I have to say that this is another image that reminds me to tell you something, which is that I was taught half by filmmakers, half by photographers. And this photograph is a response to a question from a filmmaker about my images, which is that he said, it's a great filmmaker called Billy Woodbury, but he said, where's the master shot? When we pull back, what's there? And I couldn't answer the question actually, because hip hop at that time in LA didn't have space per se. It was quite nomadic, in terms of its imprint and public space. It was quite difficult to ascertain. But where it did have space and where a lot of these cultural forms emerged from was spaces like this, which is like a garage at the back of a house where the guy left these, the guy who owned the house was an engineer, a music engineer, and left these guys live there. And they went back there and wilded out and did drugs and made music. And so I came back to him with this series of photographs of just spaces. And you'll see there's a few more in the book, but it comes from a question from a filmmaker, weirdly enough. Let me see. Is this? Oh, now my computer. Okay. This is one of my first mentors in the community. It's a brother called Father Amdi. This is his group, and this is his extended family. It's for the cover of their record. The group is called the Watts Prophets, and this was really the first elder I photographed, almost at the very, very, very beginning. This was later. These images were made later. this is another shoot that I photographed him at first. But the Watts Prophets are would now be called a spoken word group from the late 60s. They're kind of the equivalent of the Last Poets, but for Los Angeles. And Amdi was the first cat to convert to Ethiopian Orthodox west of the Mississippi. And he was one of the priests that officiated. He was very, very close to Bob Marley. And he officiated at Bob's funeral. This is a kind of the first place that I found myself in that was really important. It's a place called The Good Life. And if you can imagine in this era, like there was nowhere really to practice hip hop, to practice emceeing. And there was this place, and it was a small health food store in South Central Los Angeles, predominantly African-American area of the city, that was run by an old Black Panther, a lady by the name of B. Hall. And B, she just opened it up Thursday nights from 8 to 10, and there was only one rule, which was you couldn't cuss. And it was kind of a stroke of genius, because if you've never thought about this, I mean, creativity works best when there's limitations, and there's always limitations. I don't care if you're Steven Spielberg, there's limitations. If you're George Lucas, there's limitations. George Lucas has to deal with union rules like everybody else. George Lucas has a budget like everybody else. Steven Spielberg has a budget. I have a budget. But for these kids to not be able to cuss was a struggle. You know, you'd get the mic taken off you if you cussed. But it forced this situation where these two particular guys, actually, in this photograph, Mike and Nine on the right, and a rapper called AC Alone from this group called the Freestyle Fellowship, really raised the level of the game. And everybody in LA came through this place, including Snoop, including Ice Cube, including, you know, all the kind of big time rappers, and a lot of cats from out of town too. When they would come to LA, they would go to this place because it was a place where you could go and everybody was a hip hop head, a rapper or whatever. And I was the only photographer there. Guy on the right is his name is Toddy T. The guy on the left, his name is Big Boy. This is an image again from It's Not About a Salary. Toddy T, the guy on the right with the Compton hat, is the first guy really to do a kind of adult-oriented, social realist rap from LA that became a hit. And the song is called The Batter Ram, which is a tank that was built to break down the doors of crack houses in Los Angeles in the 80s, and was a total disaster, basically. I mean, yeah, they destroyed houses belonged to people that, you know, they went to the wrong street, they went to the wrong number, it was a mess. But he wrote this song, and it was quite humorous, but it was serious, and it became a big hit. And then it became the main influence on NWA, actually. Eazy-E heard that song, and I think it enabled him to think about the notion of a kind of social realist kind of lyrics. Anyways, you're getting a proper music history lesson here too. I'm sorry. I should be talking about photos. In this era, it was all about flash, sometimes fill, sometimes not. I had a Metz. It was way too bright. I was always struggling with it. It was like, I think I blinded people with it. This is you know, after The Good Life, there would be these sessions where guys would sharpen their tools. And this is one of those sessions with a number of rappers playing with a live drummer. I wish I had a video camera in this period. This is a kind of famous image. It's been used on the cover of a DVD about a documentary from this period. So it's pretty much, you know, like this period, it's like clubs, people's houses. And I'm starting to realize that like artwork, making the artwork for records is kind of, that's where I could actually earn enough money to live and not be scrambling, trying to do editorial and doing photographs that are stills from music videos or whatever. This is a group called The Far Side. Another one of those bedroom photographs. This is a radio DJ called Mike Nardone. He's just been selling all these records, actually. a rapper called Exhibit in San Francisco. This is kind of actually ended up being kind of an emblematic or an important image for me. This was on a music video for a song called Paparazzi. And many years later, I had the opportunity to put together orchestras to play hip hop music myself, which, yeah, when I look back, I remember this image fondly. On the left, one of my great mentors. I mean, it's hard to explain, but at that time, hip hop really felt it was so new that it wasn't really clear exactly how folks would, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of, particularly from sort of traditional Black popular music, there was a lot of folks that looked at it as some kind of a gimmick. But then the elders, meaning the Watts Prophets, and this brother right here on the left, a drummer called Billy Higgins, and then there's a guy you're about to see called Horace Tapscott, were the first elders to really make the link between the Black arts movement of the 60s and 70s in Los Angeles, which was very, very strong, and these new generation of kids that were like reaching for things like jazz, but maybe didn't have the kind of music education, or maybe they didn't have access to the knowledge. And there was a number of these figures. Billy is one of them. Horace Tapscott, the guy you're about to see, is another. Hamdi from the Watts Prophets is another, who started to build both spaces literally and spaces sort of metaphorically for the kind of guidance and the mentorship of folks like the Freestyle Fellowship and people like me. So that's why Billy is there. On the left is a writer from Los Angeles called David Axelrod. The music he's looking at is a song for Tom York, actually, from a record called Uncle, and he's rewriting the strings for it. And on the right is some members of Wu-Tang and a group called Onyx and a group called Mobb Deep. Go ahead.
Yeah, Brian, I've got another question from Martin here, and something that I want to ask you all the way through the talk. How did you get access to those groups? It really looks as if you got under the skin of those artists, almost as if you were embedded, right, into this culture. But then on the other side, you were obviously someone who wasn't born there, someone to a certain degree, you might have been a foreigner. How did this work?
Well, at first it was, I mean, I gotta say, it's like, it'd be like any documentarian going into any community, in the sense that like you start to build with folks. There are certain people that you connect with or that have some understanding of what it is you're trying to do. And I was a fan, so I wasn't like somebody who was completely unfamiliar with what was going on. I was familiar with what was going on. I was always paying attention, and so that was always it's always helpful. I mean, if you're interested in photographing music, there's a long history of photographing music, and for me that was, the basic was to go and understand that, and I collect records, and I'm interested in the way sampling works, for example, has always been something of interest to me. From hearing the early hip hop records and not realizing that it was James Brown. Obviously, I didn't have access. It's not like growing up in the UK. I didn't even grow up in Dublin. I grew up in Limerick, which is, it was like a tertiary city in Ireland, which had, records was almost impossible. And, if we had the money to buy them, which we didn't, but I think actually, the second part of the question, which is being an outsider in this moment, actually peculiarly helped, in the sense that I guess there was a notion that the reach of this culture potentially would be international, but not many people were showing up yet. I mean, to be honest, the internationally at that time, the most amount of interest was from Japanese magazines, Japanese culture. A lot of these early photos were made for Japanese magazines, believe it or not. But you would get a cosign from somebody, and they'd say, "Oh, you need to go talk to this person," And it was literally like that. This is sort of pre-internet, pre-social media, in a situation where it's like, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. Here's his number. Give him a call. Tell him I told you to call. And it was like that. And it was literally, slow, painstaking. Very early on, another thing that I did that was helpful is I made my number listed, and I sort of put out the word that anybody who was interested, who was serious and had a demo, if they wanted to make photos to present their package to a record label or whatever, that I would do it for free. And that seems in retrospect kind of a mad thing to do, but it actually really worked out. I mean, it led to me meeting a lot of cats that I otherwise wouldn't have met, perhaps, and kind of increasing my reach substantially. In that period, I also started to work for a free magazine that started out here called Urb, URB. I'm in the second edition, I think, of Urb, and that was helpful too. It gave me a platform to disseminate information, to disseminate images. So, and I started to have a little bit of a connect with the industry. They started to send me free stuff in the hope that I would write about it or photograph it. So it was a kind of, over a kind of period of a year or two, especially then I was finishing the book. I started to have, and there's an extraordinary amount of generosity, man, honestly. I mean, people want their stories to be heard. So, I was lucky. Let me keep moving. This is David Axelrod. I think he's the only person in the book who's there. I think he's in the book 3 times. He's a very important figure in my life and my work. For you guys who probably don't know who David Axelrod is, but I bet I can get some of you to know right now. Watch this. If you know the song by Snoop where it goes don't 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 don't, that is David Axelrod. So that's a sample from his work, and he's a very interesting figure, somebody who's kind of emblematic of LA. Jewish American guy who lost both his parents by the age of 14 and was basically orphaned by the age of 14 and became a kind of a runner in the jazz world. And then to help him kick heroin in the 50s, a jazz musician showed him how to write music. And then he became a kind of savant monster, basically. But worked with tons of folks and has a very distinct style of writing. Strings particularly is what he's known for. But through James Lavelle, who was the owner of Mowax Records, James wanted to write something about him, and he asked if I would shoot it, and then he introduced me to Rankin, who was doing Dazed and Confused at that time, and I don't know what they were thinking, but they were. So that photograph on the left is the first day I went to meet David, and he was very broke. His wife had been in a super tragic car accident and had and was severely disabled, and he had lost a lot of his money that he had made from the record industry in trying to take care of her. So they were living, pretty rough. Their circumstances was pretty rough, but he had all this music and all these stories. And then for the next 10 years, we became friends, and I would, I would hang out there. I would go and take him to the doctor or the dentist or whatever, and we'd make photos, and he'd tell me stories, and it was a huge learning experience for me. I'll keep moving. And that's his great mentor, which is Campbell Adderley on the right. This is Kamasi Washington, kind of forefront of jazz music right now. Horace Tapscott, another mentor, an image made at a anti-police brutality event in 1997. And on the right is an image from a music video I directed in Mexico. And Horace died the weekend we were shooting down there, and this was one of the characters from the video. And there's a famous poem about Horace, of which the refrain is, "I am Horace Tapscott, I am not for sale." And so "I'm not for sale" is written on the man's apron. But Horace was a kind of in-demand pianist from the 50s who realized that the music industry in the end didn't have the interests of the community or the culture in mind, and took his practice back to the community, and became the band leader for the Black Panthers, wrote arrangements for a bunch of people, but most significantly, he took the jazz music back into the community and put it at the doorstep of the community, and lived from the community for the rest of his life, which is really kind of an extraordinary thing to do. He gave up music professionally, so to speak, and went back and did it as a kind of vocation. And it's wonderful, wonderful guy, wonderful teacher too. Amazing. So here's people you might know. Eazy-E with Bone Thugs-n-Harmony, and a lot of marijuana.
Is that all marijuana there on the scale?
Yeah, yes, indeed. And in the bags in the foreground. This is from an era when, this is from like 1995, I think. And Dr. Dre, who had been in NWA with Eazy, had put out a record called The Chronic. And The Chronic is slang for marijuana, but Dr. Dre never really smoked marijuana. And Eazy was very upset, and he was a friend. He was actually the first person to give me an album cover job. And he he said, "Man, I'm really not feeling this Dr. Dre, blah, 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 making it look like he's the weed guy out of the group. I'm the weed guy out of the group. So I want you to, can you come by my mother's house?" I went to his mother's house. I mean, she wasn't living there anymore, but it was her original house. And then he took out a couple of pounds of weed, I think it was. And then me and my assistant sat there and made images. And that group, Bone Thugs-n-Harmony, he had just signed them to his label, and they became huge. But they weren't ready for what he was smoking. So it was it was a mad afternoon. And it, just for context, why does it go after this image? And it goes after this image because Horace Tapscott actually was one of the greatest weed smokers I've ever had the pleasure of sharing pot with. Street photograph, same period. Really, for me, speaks to the kind of weird angst that existed in Los Angeles after the riots of '92. People began to see the city differently. Record producer and record dealer, his name just eludes me, it'll come back, but he had written a song, Sonny Craver, and he had written a song which for me is the first hip hop song in Los Angeles. It's not even a hip hop song, it's a funk song, called the Campbell Lock. And it's named for a dance, which isn't that unusual for sort of funk songs to be named for a dance. But in this case, it's not just a dance, it's a dancer. And the dancer is a very important dancer called Don Campbell. And Don Campbell was one of the Soul Train dancers, and he was the first one to do that locking, which for the rest of the world is the robot, basically. But Don Campbell was kind of invented that in LA. Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Nate Dogg, DJ Quick, Snoop, a very, very young Snoop. Snoop when he was like, I don't know if he was like 19 or 20. Right by his house, the Palms area of Los Angeles. And on the left is an image, that's another famous image from that period, but there was a truce, a gang truce after the riots of '92. And these guys were instrumental. This photograph was made. It was part of a larger story, but this photograph was made in Nickerson Gardens in Los Angeles. I can imagine you guys are like, what the hell? So on the left is a photograph of a great proto-rapper called Blowfly. And Blowfly is a character invented by this gentleman called Clarence Reed. Clarence Reed was a soul singer, came from the Miami area. He's originally from Georgia, but came from Miami, and or at least signed to a label in Miami. And he's kind of instrumental in inventing disco. Just sidebar, but he also invented this character called Blowfly. Blowfly was a soul singer and rapper who would do kind of perverse versions of soul songs. So as opposed to like sitting on the dock of the bay, he would do shitting on the dock of the bay, and it would be, you know, sort of scatological humor meets soul music, and had a career like this where he would wear this mask, and that's him with his mom. She was in her late 80s. He was in his, I guess he was in his early 70s. He's dead now, but it was very funny. She was really reluctant to make the images with him wearing the mask. And then he's famous for flipping off the camera. And as soon as he started, she got up and left. But she's, you know, it's quite a proper Southern conservative church-going woman. And then he's this sort of maniacal, crazy son. On the right is a town just north of Miami called Plantation. There's just too many. As you can see, I mean, I make photographs, but I make photographs that sometimes operate on an entirely photographic way, and then sometimes they're really about a kind of naming or a kind of indexical, a kind of pointing to certain things, but they each have their own kind of internal logic. But yeah, given the history of slavery in the United States, the notion that there's a town called Plantation and that Plantation has a technology park, to me is just, was too useful of a, was too helpful for me to not want to. And Blowfly for me is really, you know, embodies a certain kind of plantation technology, actually, in the way that he, you know, he tells the story of how he began Blowfly was basically because he used to get teased at school because he was raised by his grandparents and they were so poor. He never had clothes, he never had anything. He used to always get teased. And how he gained a cachet in the world was by taking popular songs from the radio and changing the lyrics into the kind of scatological, crazy vision of the world that he had. So that was important. I'm going to keep going. George Clinton on the right, Leon Ware on the left, super important figures in the history of Black music. Holger, tell me if I'm like, because I can't see anything except my screen. So tell me how I'm doing time-wise and when I need to stop.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think we've probably have about maybe about 15 minutes left. Yeah.
In total, including questions or
plus questions then on
okay.
top. Yeah. What would be really interesting also to touch on is your transition then into music videography. Yeah. So as a producer, maybe, you know, we can reserve the last 5 or 10 minutes for this, or whenever you feel you would like to talk about this, because that's obviously, you know, it's a very interesting evolution process, I think, as a photographer.
For sure. Yeah, that's no problem. There's something sort of aesthetically that emerges in this period for me that I think is probably important to say, and I can say it at this point. There's a group called the Nonce. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, maybe this is as good a point as I need to break off. At a certain point, you know, after getting out of grad school and not really feeling like I had a voice per se in terms of what I did with the camera, but still making images and understanding how to make compelling images, I had a kind of crisis of conscience around a kind of a famous photograph, actually. These are photographs. On the left is from Panama City. There's a soul singer called Kabir. On the right is MF Doom wearing the outfit of Danger Mouse. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. This was a commission. I was asked to go make a portrait of him. And it's one of those things, and maybe I can use this photograph to talk about it, actually. You know, inside the house, yeah, I found a place where there was nice light and there was a chair, and he sat there and he kind of held this cushion, and yeah, the images were interesting. I mean, it was cool. But as I left and as he closed the door, I saw the reflection and I was, wait! And I took my camera out and I said, can you just hold the door right there? And for me, this is about this is that period where I start to really think about actually being able to operate in the moment, as opposed to up until this point, I'm trying to contrive a moment with you, where I'm trying to, oh fuck, if I would have only brought the other light, or I don't have the right lens, or damn, the ratio of light outside to the light in here is too crazy, or fighting, as opposed to fighting the environment to make some preconceived idea you have in your head of what a photograph should or shouldn't be. These kinds of photographs emerge out of a kind of an abandonment of that idea, and moving into a kind of an idea that the light that's there actually is the perfect light. And it is possible to make an interesting or compelling image from that light. Obviously, this is within reason. Of course, I'm shooting film, which is a little bit more complicated, I think, than digital, especially in low light circumstances. But it's philosophically, then it freed me. What I appreciated about it is that philosophically it freed me to have a more qualitative kind of exchange with my subjects. And that was the big breakthrough. And that breakthrough came, let me see if I can, Axelrod again. Musician called Shugi Otis. Bill Withers just passed away a few weeks ago. Bill Withers, wow, okay. Raz Kaz on the left, drum on the right. Notorious B.I.G., kind of an important image. Timmy Thomas, musician from Miami, amazing. Wrote the song Why Can't We Live Together, which became the soundtrack for the end of apartheid and also became the first hit for Sade. And is also sampled by, The Youth. It's also sampled by Drake on Hotline Bling. Somebody must know that. Okay. This image was really, it's one of the more famous images I've made. It's the cover of the first DJ Shadow record from OX. The record is called Introducing. You can see the continuing interest in in this aspect ratio, obviously from the earlier photographs, although this is a Fuji 618 or 617 or 618 camera. So it's medium format, and it's 6 high and 18 wide. So it's a beast of a camera, But the thing about this image is that after all the kind of struggling with film, struggling with lenses, struggling with, feeling completely inadequate unless I had shot like every film known to man on every shoot. This was a shoot where I actually realized that, the light in the room and paying attention, because we went there and the DJ Shadow had done a kind of stick figure drawing of exactly what he wanted for the cover, which was not this. And, at the end of me doing the kind of insurance shots of exactly what he wanted, I said, it'd be much more interesting in terms of perspective if we shot down the racks as opposed to across them. And then the cat showed up. And then through a mistake of communication between me and my assistant, that camera needs to be focused manually, using a measuring tape. She gave me the distance in feet or meters, and I misunderstood, and we messed it up. And so it ended up that the foreground is out of focus and the background is in focus. But there was something about that shoot where I realized I figured out a way to get free, or more free, within what I was doing. And it's more of a documentary approach, I guess, in the sense that you're not adding, you're trying not to add anything or disturb too much of what's there. But it really, and similarly, I have to be honest, like I really benefited when it came time to make music videos from this as well, which is that, there's people that make music videos where you could have a crew of 100 and that wouldn't be weird. And I did a video like that once, and I was I already have social anxiety, so that was just like absolutely untenable. And so, yeah, I started a production company with a guy who had started assisting me, but I realized he's actually a fantastic photographer, Eric Coleman. And we built it around this sort of principle that if the equipment fit in our backpack, we would shoot it. If it didn't fit in the backpack, we wouldn't. And it freed us up tremendously. It means you could show up on set with like, a small camera bag and be enough. And, over the years, a number of people, I remember the actress Chloe Sevigny said, we showed up and she was like, where's all the gear? And we were like, this is all the gear. And then she started laughing and she said, you guys made all those images with just no gear? I was like, yeah. And then it just, it was just one of those kind of conversation starters. People are, especially if you photograph people that are considered celebrities or whatever, they expect the trailer, the assistance, the whole rigmarole that goes with photography. And we just sidestepped that whole thing. And it really changed the way I made images. It was really helpful, actually. So.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think for a lot of photographers, the equipment is almost they almost seem to have a love-hate relationship with the equipment. Yeah, really often there's too much gear. It's too difficult to control, and I think very often it's about reducing this. I mean, if you think about the white stripes, it's all about three, right? I mean, obviously like a band. Which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. But they could have had an orchestra if they wanted, yeah. But instead of that, they went the complete opposite way. They just limited to 3 elements, and that's it.
The thing is that what you have to understand is that, for me at least, and I mean this is something that everybody arrives at in their own way, but for me, this is about a particular kind of exchange. This is something where me and the subject, or me and whoever I show up with in the subject, are going to have a proper kind of social exchange for the next however long we have, a half an hour, 3 hours, a whole day, whatever it is. And everything else is kind of in the way, basically. It can be in the way. It can slow things down. It can make you think twice about particular places you might want to go. In the location, it can changes the way in which people present themselves. It all feeds into the kind of performance that we're able to deliver. And for me, it was more important to prioritize the exchange than it was to prioritize the production value per se. It wasn't something I was that interested in. So I just, okay, let's get rid of it. And then it felt at first like it was a bit terrifying, to show up with no gear. Was like, really? It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You guys are showing up with no lights. It's like, yep, here we are. But in the end, it's allowed a particular kind of voice to emerge in terms of the images. People recognize continuity between the kinds of performances I get from folks and whatnot. Is different. Anyways, these are record stores. It's another series that I was working on the whole time. I have to say, that's the other thing, is that I understood from art school, part of my art school training is that you didn't, I think it saddens me a lot when I talk to folks and they talk about how they're not shooting because there's no gigs. Because I never really thought of it like that the gig was affording me the opportunity to shoot. I mean, I was shooting anyway. I mean, the stuff that I'm interested in, I just do it, And I think that's really important, and for a number of reasons, actually, which is that obviously to keep the sword sharp, but also I think you have to think about creativity as something that needs to be fed, and for me, most of the discoveries I've made over the years have been in, projects that I was working on to the side that didn't make any sense to me maybe a lot of the times, or I was just doing it to keep sharp, and I'll find light and I'll find things that I realized that then afterwards became, when I was in the commission, I would never be stuck. I just from the fact that the sword was sharp, I'll never come across a situation where I would be stuck. Like, oh no, what am I going to do? Never happened. Let's go for a walk. So that was my answer. Let's just go for a walk. And having the confidence to kind of say like, no, actually, this is the way that I work. You know, I'm not interested in that you want me to shoot tethered, or you want to see every Polaroid, or you want to be looking over my shoulder the entire time. That's not really the way I work. I mean, if you're hiring me for making the kinds of images that you've seen in the book, then, you know, you have to respect that, well, they're made in a particular way. It's not accidental. You know, it might look very casual. It might look very informal. I mean, that's the beauty of it, I think. But yeah, and that came from really building projects like this, you know, where it's like, you know, I'm going to actually try and photograph all the people I know that sell records. And of course, now it's records was a huge resurgence. But at this time, this was a declining population of people.
Mm. Can I ask, Brian, do you still shoot film?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's very good to hear. I've just discovered on the when you showed your desktop, I just discovered there was a little flex color icon, you know, like the scanning software, like the Imacon scanning software. Yeah, I must say I was really I was really glad to see this there, really, because I was wondering if you still do film, yeah, because yeah, it's you know, when I saw for the first time your images, I thought the film element was a really important element to it, yeah. And also I think the directness that you actually have with the equipment, and you know, ultimately, like a digital camera can actually be like a black box. You don't really quite know what is actually happening on the inside. You just get a result out of it. But yeah, I think with the film camera, there's a certain relationship between the subject and the equipment and the photographer that you might not actually get from digital equipment, I guess.
I agree. I mean, for me, the problematic is that somehow the notion that the back of the camera is a somewhere that we share so that people know what we're doing while we're doing it, often can be a kind of invasion. So I generally try to shoot digitally. If I'm shooting in a situation like this, for example, these kinds of portraits, I shoot digital the way I would shoot film. In other words, I don't stop and look, because I feel like it really interrupts whatever's going on. And I kind of understand how the performance is going in terms of how many, just in terms of how people are reacting to the click. You know, you can tell when people are counting, you can tell when people are desperately uncomfortable, you can tell. And sometimes that's what you want. I mean, you know, it's up to yourself. But if I'm spending too much time taking the camera from my face and looking, it breaks the moment somehow for me. And so I try to avoid that. I don't like shooting tethered. You know, if there's clients there, I generally try to encourage them that we'll have a workflow where I'll shoot for a while and I'll pass off the card, and then there'll be a kind of digital village somewhere where they can sit around and look at it, and then they can bring me word. But that there's no place really for the client in the kind of in between me and the subject is a bad idea. And it, you know, not everybody is wants to work that way, but generally people are you know, if you assert that into the situation, I think generally people are respectful of it, or at least they should be. So, but I agree. Ramsey on the left. One of the earliest photographs I took, actually, a kid called Dags at a show in LA. E40. T-Love, will.i.am, very, very young will.i.am. I know will.i.am since he was 13. When he was a baby. One of the few photographs of a space that's really important in American popular music, called The Dungeon. My Hasselblad, the shutter died that day. That's why the image looks the way it does. It was 2 stops underexposed or 3 stops underexposed because my shutter died. A very, very young outcast. And they were teenagers. DJ Screw. I'll tell you a funny story about this photograph, which I was thinking of posting in the last few days, but George Floyd, the man who was murdered by the police in Minneapolis, was a rapper in this scene. He went by Big Floyd, and he would have worked in that building actually, with the DJ called DJ Screw, who passed away. But it's just crazy with the week that's in it. Yeah, sometimes you just see things and you just need to photograph them, and this couch was one of them. It's one of those, like, I don't know, I spent a lot of time in my life thinking about the notion of non-productive labor. And, you know, in terms of what art is, in terms of like how to think of, you know, the activities of life, but like labor as something that is, can be taken away from the sort of traditional Marxist sense of kind of productive labor, and think of it in terms of non-productive labor. And this is a kind of, I mean, there's real work in this, but what it amounts to in terms of something that you could sell or you could whatever, it doesn't make any sense, but there's real work. And that always interests me. It's a photograph I made of this group called Dilated Peoples at LAX just before 9/11. A singer called Eugene McDaniels, beautiful guy. Mad Lib. Another kind of elder, really important guy, Conrad Johnson, who left the jazz industry to went back and became an educator, and basically made the best stage band in the world out of the Third Ward in Houston, Texas, like a proper hood. He made this band that they were unbeatable. They traveled around the world and they beat everybody, and they were all black, and they played popular music, and they were all like 14, 15, 16. And he was their teacher. The Fugees, very early Fugees, like they were recording the score. Yeah, I'm still friends with Lauren. See Lauren from time to time.
Brian, I've got a few questions here. We probably have to transit to Q&As relatively soon. Just checking, is that okay with you?
Yeah, I mean, I can still keep clicking away here, and I can answer questions.
It's really amazing. You really appear to be like a chronologist of the early and maybe even the current scene. Really, there are just so many incredibly fantastic pictures of all those stars. But what I also really, really particularly enjoy is the element of behind the scenes, like how much you appear to be embedded into the scene, like almost a type of access that I would have thought is incredibly difficult to gain. And also to keep this in, and also to link this then with your early influences with a very conceptual fine art based approach. It's just absolutely amazing, I think. So for all the listeners here, so if you've got any questions now, I'm going to read out the remaining questions to Brian, and we'll probably wrap up in about 5 to 10 minutes, I guess. So we've got a question. Yeah, we've got a question here from JOJ. He asks, how did you get access to all these amazing artists?
To be honest, there's as many stories as there is, you know, but in general, I was in LA. I was really one of the few folks that was serious out here about photographing hip hop in that period, which is, let's say, the early 90s. I did do some editorial. I was the photo editor for a magazine called Rap Pages for a while. And if I ever felt like I wanted to photograph somebody, I was only ever one step removed. And that's really a testament, not so much to my ability to make things happen, but it was as much to do with the notion of just how small of a cottage industry hip hop was in that moment. And I can't stress that enough. It was kind of everybody knew everybody. It was like, you knew this guy, and then he knew somebody from New York, and they were one step away from Nas, or they were one step away from, you know, like I would know somebody who knew the Beatnuts. The Beatnuts were producing for Nas, or I knew somebody who knew Pete Rock, you know. And so it was that really, it was really hand to hand.
Yeah,
And
I've got a really lovely question from
people. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a really lovely question from Debbie. So just everyone, if you're wondering, I also get quite a lot of questions just from fans onto my mobile phone. And Debbie asks if Snoop is cool.
Snoop is really cool. I mean, he has his moments, but Snoop is very cool. In that era, there's something profoundly charismatic about him. There always was. He's very tall and very thin, and kind of striking looking. And he's just one of those cats that's like always happy to see you, always with the quick snapback, and very easy with people, as compared to somebody like Ice Cube, who I think is a lot more reserved. Snoop was always one of them dudes, like he was always, "Oh, Mr. Photographer, what's up, man?" It was always like he carried a lot of energy, and I think that's a good amount of his success really comes from how charismatic he can be. So
yeah. And another question is about the collaboration involved for those record covers. If you were just hanging out with those people, with the musicians, or was there a lot of like directing and waiting involved? Was there a lot of production involved, or was it a rather loose get together?
It generally was the way it would work in those days, even for editorial, actually. If they ask, so and so the Fugees, let's say, their first record's about to come out, and we are interested in having you come and make some photographs for them for this magazine. Okay, I need the music. I need the music. For me, to spend an hour and listen to the music and just kind of allow myself to think of, even if it's something that completely wasn't possible or completely, but to allow myself to kind of exist in the space of the music was always been really important for me. So no music, no photos.
I see.
Because
good.
For me, who you meet when you show up, you don't know, but yeah.
Okay, good. We probably have to come to an end very soon, unfortunately. We've got a big thank you here from Martin, who says a big thanks for your generous time and that this was a fantastic talk. And another big thank you here from Debbie again. Yes, so there's all right. There's a last minute question coming in from Debbie. She asks if you actually need the music. If you needed the music, I assume it's.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very, for me personally, at least. I mean, I can go make a portrait of anybody, but if you want to get the full experience, I guess it's really important to have the music. Yeah, it's nearly impossible. Like if I don't, we're gonna go photograph this musician today. Oh, you've never heard of him? Oh, never mind. It's not the same thing. No, it's really important for me. Even if sometimes I've had situations where I go somewhere and they sit me down and we play, we play the music, and then I start to think about it. But for me, it helps me to understand where, how should we see this person? Like there needs to be some kind of relationship between like what it is we hear and how we picture these folks. So yeah, it's important. And even, not even just if you can imagine it in terms of the portrait itself, but perhaps another thing I should say that I'm always kind of keen to pay attention to is, especially if you're making environmental portraits, is like, what are the appropriate details? So like, if I take the face out of this entirely, what's the important detail here? Is it the hands? Is it the feet? Is it the jewelry? Is it the view from the window? What's significant here? And I can only do that when I have some context, and the context usually is provided by the music. So,
all right. Thank you so much for this really fantastic talk. I thoroughly enjoyed this.